gentlemen, I guess all I can say is welcome to a new day in Prince Edward Island.
When we make mistakes, we will humbly own them and work to do better. When we defend our choices, we will do so with evidence and facts, not talking points and personal attacks.
On Tuesday of last week, the United Conservative Party won 324,000 more votes than the combined total of our two legacy parties in 2015.
Two provinces have elected new governments in the last 10 days. First, Albertans handed Jason Kenney, you just saw him there, and the United Conservative Party a majority government last week, and Prince Edward Island elected what looks to be a minority PC government this week. Last fall, New Brunswick's election also ended without a majority mandate. So what do the election results say about what voters in those provinces want, and what might the new provincial political realities mean for this fall's federal election? Let's bring in the Premier's League. In our London bureau, Alison Redford, Premier of Alberta from 2011 to 2014. Brian Gallant led New Brunswick from 2014 to 2018, and he's joining us from Toronto. And joining us from sunny Florida, Robert Giz, Premier of P.E.I. from 2007 to 2015, now President and CEO of the Canadian Wireless Telecommunications Association. Hi to all three of you. It's great to see you. Thanks for making time for us this afternoon. Really appreciate it. Ms. Redford, I'm going to start with you. Let's start with the Alberta election, the outcome of that election. What do you read into Mr. Kenney's resounding victory there?
Well, I think that people were really talking about the economy, and even though there were other issues that came up, that's what people were concerned about. You know, the difficulty in Alberta is that right now for us, it's all about pipelines, and it's going to be a really complicated solution to try to deal with this. But I do think that it was certainly an expected victory, and I think there's very high expectations for him. He's an experienced politician, and starting out as Premier of Alberta will have some particular experiences that might be very helpful in helping to resolve the pipeline issue.
Were you surprised, Ms. Redford, at the sort of, I guess, breadth of the victory, or did you think it would be sort of the way that it played out?
Well, I was watching and, of course, talking to people for about a month ahead of time, and it was very clear from the beginning of the campaign that as long as the campaign focused on economy, that Premier Kenney was seen as the solution to that, and that did not change over the course of the campaign. So I wasn't surprised by the result.
Mr. Giz, I've got to get your reaction to the most recent provincial election in P.E.I. Did you expect those results?
Well, I expected a change in government. You know, it's been 12 years of Liberal government in the province, and maybe once over the last 150 years have we actually seen a government get reelected 4 times in a row. I think where the surprise came from was that you saw the Greens leading for the last year or 2 years in the polls, and Dennis King, with the Progressive Conservatives, just recently elected, ran an extremely positive campaign. In fact, all leaders did. And I think it was a testament to these leaders coming in, running positive campaigns, 3 different parties competing for the election. And it led to perhaps the most fascinating election of my generation in Prince Edward Island, and one of the most fascinating outcomes, where we actually have a minority government for the first time in over 100 years, and we actually have the Green Party as the representing the official opposition.
What do you think was behind the desire for change in P.E.I., Mr. Giz?
You know, I'm going to say it was timing. The economy was doing extremely well. Premier McLaughlin was doing a good job as Premier. But, you know, when you start in government, and if you're going to be in there for 12 years, I used to like to use the analogy, I guess, it's like, you know, walking up a hill with a backpack. You start on day 1 and rocks keep getting dropped in your backpack. And the longer you're there, the more likely you're going to tip over. And really, that's what happened after 12 years of government. And I think you really have to equate it to, you know, what we're seeing in other jurisdictions across the country. There are some differences in Alberta, obviously, and in New Brunswick. But if you look at Ontario, the Liberal government's been in power there, or they were for almost 15 years. You look in Quebec, the same thing happened. The same thing happened in British Columbia. So I think there is a touch of a natural cycle that's taking place.
Mr. Gallant, let me get you to weigh in on sort of that sentiment and the idea that there is an appetite for change, but perhaps that appetite is not being parked in the more traditional places. And we saw evidence of that in P.E.I, as Mr. Giz referred to, with the level of support for the Green Party. We also saw it in the New Brunswick election, right? Three Green MLAs elected there as well. What do you think is, do you think there is something to that? The idea that voters are more and more so looking towards non-traditional options as a place to put their vote?
Well, absolutely. And I think there's lots of signs that if I were the federal Liberals and the federal government, I would be making sure I learn from and see. We have noticed over the last few elections a few things. One is, even if your economy is going really well, normally you would think you would get re-elected as a government, but that just hasn't been the case in several elections over the last few months, and maybe extending right up to the BC election as well. Another lesson is clearly that there doesn't seem to be the binary choice happening that we would have seen before. People are saying to themselves, it's not really just about who gets to be the Prime Minister or the Premier, it's also about who's my MLA and what message am I sending by sending whoever it is that I'll be sending to our capital. Another lesson is clearly, I think, another sign is clearly that there is some angst across the country and across the Western world, so it really isn't proper to us, where I think people are very worried about income inequality. And that is manifesting itself in different ways. I think the current federal government has certainly done a lot over the last 4 years to help the middle class and those working hard to join it, whether it be with the enhancement of the CPP, investments in childcare, the child tax benefit, affordable housing, education and training investments. So they're certainly doing a lot, but there's angst out there, and that's manifesting itself in different ways in different provinces and even different jurisdictions in the Western world. But there's no question that at the heart of a lot of the populist movements that we've seen and the rise of third parties, I think, is income inequality.
Do you think, I mean, you talk about lessons for the federal government. What are the lessons for federal parties? If there was one out of that, if you were running for a federal party right now in the next election, what would you want to make sure you're aware of?
Well, politically speaking, I mean, obviously there's the policies that you would want to see move forward. But politically speaking, I think it's very much the fact that in several elections now, people don't see it as a binary choice between the traditional parties. They are saying to themselves, well, we can vote for different people because we like that person, or we like a part of that party's platform, or we know this party won't form government unless there's a minority situation, which could be interesting if they're a part of it, or even if they're not a part of a minority government. I just want them to go to the Capitol and talk about these issues that I care about. There's no question that that's happening. And in New Brunswick, we saw it on the left and the right. We saw 3 MLAs from the Green Party get elected, 3 MLAs from a very right-wing party called the People's Alliance. Therefore, we see it happening on all sides of the spectrum. Therefore, if you're a federal politician, what does that mean for your party? And there's no question another aspect of this sort of angst is the fact that, and we've seen this for years now in the Western world, is it's hard to be a centrist party these days. It's very difficult, and centrist parties have to make sure that, politically speaking, that they sort of protect both sides of their support, and also it can lead them to really going maybe more to the left or more to the right. So I think we've seen some of that transpire over the last few months in several provincial elections. It'll obviously be an important factor in the federal election as well.
Would you agree with that sentiment, Ms. Redford, that it's hard to be a centrist party right now?
Well, I think it is, because I think that people that are voting are very demanding and are expecting an awful lot very quickly from their governments. What struck me, and what I think is going to be interesting to watch in Canada in the next 6 months, is that if we look at something like, for example, Premier Kenney's first piece of legislation, which he promises will be to revoke the carbon tax, and the federal government's response to that, which is that they will then constitutionally impose a carbon tax, I think that really does then become an issue that will become part of the national debate. Of course, the leader of the Conservative Party federally has been talking about that carbon tax as something that's important in terms of economic growth. And I think the other thing that's interesting is to think about how, for the first time, this generation of Canadians who are voting are going to be back into seeing sort of a polarization between regions and also constitutional issues coming up again, which is new and different than what we've seen for some time. And I think that Alberta will, and Premier Kenney will take that kind of a position with respect to carbon tax, pipeline, whether it's relating to Quebec or British Columbia. And I think we'll start to see a conversation that when I was young, we used to have in Canada about what are the constitutional roles of provinces, how do Canadians feel about being part of Canada, are we all part of the same team, are we all moving forward in the same direction? And the difference this time is we have a lot of millennials who I think in P.E.I. and in New Brunswick have certainly looked to alternative parties like the Green Party. So this issue of climate, carbon tax, climate change, the Green Party could be a very interesting component of where we go in the next 6 months in Canada.
There has been a lot of talk, especially with the outcome of the election and sort of surprise outcome to some degree of the election in PEI, about this sort of blue wave or blue dots and what that means when you sort of position what the table looks like now between the Prime Minister and the provinces and what it looked like back in 2015. What's your take on that?
I've got a couple of different opinions there. One is, I don't think what you're seeing right now with provinces moving towards conservative governments is necessarily a bad thing for the federal Liberals. And I say that because I look back historically when the Trudeau Sr. was in power, a lot of the provincial governments were conservative. When Mulroney came in, you saw, I think it was 86. My father came in Prince Edward Island. 87, you had Frank McKenna. 87, you had David Peterson. And then when Prime Minister Harper was in, you saw numerous Liberal governments elected. Now, where I do see a bit of an issue is the volatility of the voter today. It's not like voters back then moved from Liberal to Conservative. Today, the Green Party's an option. We see a right-wing party in New Brunswick that's an option. So if I was the federal Liberals, I would be watching to see where that Green vote's going, how committed that vote is, and what you need to do to be able to pull in some of that vote. But I also believe that they can't just let the right go by as well. Jobs in the economy, we saw that play out in Alberta, and I think that the federal Liberals do need to find that balance out there between millennials who are concerned with the environment, and you've got some other people that are concerned with the economy. And I think that being aware that the electorate is extremely volatile will be very important.
Mr. Gallant, I take Mr. Giz's point about the sort of historical context around having a Prime Minister of one stripe and provinces of another. Is there any difference this time, though, when you have such a central issue like the carbon tax at the heart of what the fight appears to be about?
Well, I think both Alison and Robert make very good points, and your question, Vashi, I think is the right one to ask. I mean, there's no question moving forward that fighting climate change, putting a price on carbon pollution, or a carbon tax, whichever way you want to talk about it, is going to be a big issue, potentially the issue. Well, what's interesting is that it could play in favor for many political parties depending on how it all sort of spins out. So the fact that Kenney, Ford, Higgs are all premiers now, really to build on Robert's point, is a bit of an opportunity, I think, for the federal Liberals. It's always nice to have somebody that you can actually have a fight against. And clearly, Kenney, Ford, Higgs, they all realize that it's good politics for them as well. I can tell you in New Brunswick that Premier Higgs has certainly made it a point to criticize the federal Liberals as much as he possibly can, and I think we saw that with the election of Premier-elect Kenney, and of course we've seen that with Premier Ford over the last little while as well. So it's an opportunity for all of them. It's really an opportunity for the provinces led by these premiers, but also for the Prime Minister and the federal Liberals. You could very well see this whole election turn on that very question, which would be interesting to see how it would all sort of shake out, because at the end of the day, going back to sort of my comments from a while ago, if it does become a binary choice, I think the federal Liberals are in a better position. But if it becomes one where people feel that they can send different MPs to Ottawa and people will sort of figure it out once they get there, that could be a little more dangerous politically for the federal Liberals. So if they make it a binary choice between the ilks of the Prime Minister and the federal Liberals wanting to fight climate change, which is humanity's largest challenge, I think everybody recognizes that in our country at the moment, and that they have a concrete plan to do so, and they use that to contrast with people like Premiers Kenney, Ford, and Higgs. I mean, it could be a very interesting sort of fight, and I think it could be to the advantage of the federal Liberals.
If the fight is an opportunity, Ms. Redford, for the provinces and for the federal government, where does that leave Canadians?
Well, there's two answers to that. I think that what we'll see for the next term or so in government is a country that is a little more divided than we've seen in the past. I think we're going to see a lot more regional politics at play. And I don't think that's good for Canada as a whole. I think it's better for us to be working together to one common goal. I'll say that something else that I think people will have to be reminded of, and I grew up in Alberta, boy, you know, when you start to get into regional politics and one particular issue, it may be that we in Alberta think a certain way about a particular policy, but the reality is there have been a lot of federal governments that have been elected in this country without electing anyone from particular provinces, such as Alberta. And because of that, I think it's important that when we look at these issues, we try to find consensus so that we can move forward together as Canadians and be doing the bridge building.
I just want to switch topics really briefly before I have to go and pick up with you, Ms. Redford, because we are in the middle of a flood crisis kind of in a number of provinces, including Mr. Gallant's province in New Brunswick. I know you were Premier during the Calgary floods. I'm wondering, there's a lot of discussion around incentivizing people to move out of flood zones and how that might work. Should it be voluntary? Should it be something otherwise? Based on your experience in that role, what do you think?
Well, when we had the floods in Alberta, we were starting to come to terms with some of those issues around land use. After the flood, people were very motivated to try to start making that shift. But unfortunately, people forgot very quickly. And because of that, those debates about whether or not people should be building on floodplains are still going on. And I think that what we see now every year are floods. It's a constant reminder of what the new reality is. And I think and I hope that we don't have loss of life and that regions that are affected this year can come out of it as quickly as we were able to in Alberta. But there is a long-term lesson, and we are going to have to start to think about what to do with that. And at the end of the day, nobody should want to live on a floodplain, and we can't anymore presume that a flood's only going to happen once every 100 years, because it's just not the case.
And what are the implications, Mr. Gallant, do you think, for New Brunswick of that? Because that has been certainly the discussion, besides the sort of immediate concerns that everyone is dealing with. This idea that last year we were saying this was a 1 in 100-year occurrence, and this year we're looking at a similar, if not worse, situation.
That's right, Vashi. And let me start off by just saying a big thank you to all the first responders and officials that are working very hard from all levels of government, cooperating to make sure that people in New Brunswick can get the support that they need. And we're obviously thinking of all those affected. And you're absolutely right to say what you just said. While I was Premier, we had the largest ice storm we had ever seen in the history of our province. And then not too long after, we had the largest flood we had ever seen in the history of our province, so we're obviously recorded. Then the season after, the year after, same season, you see the same thing happen. So it really does beg the question that, is this going to be somewhat the new norm? And there's no question that these events are not specifically due to climate change, but the severity and the frequency which we are seeing in New Brunswick is due to climate change. So it really does tie into what we talked about, and I think over the next few months for the election, that means that these types of events happening are going to become more frequent and be more severe. So it's going to be more top of mind as well on when people are going to go cast their ballots, and hopefully as a country we're going to have a serious and mature discussion about how we're going to play our role to fight climate change and to adapt to the new reality that we have before us.
Final word to you, Mr. Giz.
Yeah, you know, it's as Canadians, I think we need to look at some of these disasters that are happening and realize that the world is changing, and we need to make sure that we're there to deal with these things. And I think that there's going to be some tough decisions to make as Canadians over the next number of years, but we're still very fortunate to live in one of the best democracies in the world, and I think that I'm still very optimistic about Canada's future.
All right, a positive note to end on. Thank you so much to all three of you for your time today. Thanks to Alison Redford, Brian Gallant, and Robert Giz.